We should not forget, however, that this was also the period when China grew faster than us, when their GDP became 4 times our size and their military spending increased by a proportionate amount. At this point, this is a tense relationship. Our External Affairs Minister has himself characterized this as an abnormal situation. The current leadership sees the challenge in the 21st century as being rather different from that of the 20th century. That having been said, it is important to remember that these protests were spontaneous and random. It is unlikely that the United States will simply be a bystander if China were to take control of Taiwan.
In 1939, Winston Churchill said that Russia was a riddle wrapped in a mystery inside an enigma. Today, China has replayed Russia as that riddle in Churchill's statement. It believes in tendencies reading of history to make assertive geographical claims on its neighbors. It spends 7 times more on public safety than military spending. Now, public safety out here is a euphemism for keeping tabs on its citizens through surveillance and other means. After the phenomenal success of its private enterprises, it is now cracking down on those private enterprises under the garb of common prosperity. The virus, which originated in Wuhan, has come back to haunt Xi Jinping, who is now relaxing his anti-COVID measures, the zero COVID policy. Now, China is, I believe, actually a riddle and very difficult to understand. And who better than Shri Vijay Gokhale, Foreign Secretary and author of the Tiananmen Square, The Making of a Protest, and The Long Game, how the Chinese played the long game. I mean, this is a must-read for every China watcher. Welcome to Samvad, sir.
Thank you, Mayank.
To start off with, the first question which comes to mind is since 2020 and Galwan, India and China have had 16 rounds of military commander level talks. And the progress is I would say, in my assessment, not so great. As friction points and grave friction points remain between the two countries, there is barely any visible diplomatic activity. And so, in your assessment, where do you see this diplomatic and political relationship between India and China heading, especially with Xi Jinping firmly in power?
That's an important question, Mayank. And to understand the current situation, we have to go back about 25 or 30 years. When Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi visited China in December 1988, he reached a broad agreement which covered 3 basic points with his then counterpart, Deng Xiaoping. One point was that India would no longer make normalized relations with China conditional upon the resolution of the border dispute. In other words, we would move parallelly on a 2-track approach of settling the boundary dispute and simultaneously improving our relations with China. The second understanding was that pending the settlement of this dispute, neither side would use force or threat of use of force. And the final understanding was that both countries would give each other the space and the time to rise simultaneously in a post-Cold War order. This was a broad understanding which was maintained for 20-odd years. It allowed for 2 important agreements to maintain peace and tranquility in the border areas. And we also saw a substantial improvement of all-round relations between India and China between 1990 and 2010. We should not forget, however, that this was also the period when China grew faster than us, when their GDP became 4 times our size and their military spending increased by a proportionate amount. And therefore, by the time President Xi Jinping came to office, the Chinese were economically, militarily, and diplomatically in a superior position to us. And it is perhaps possible that the new leadership believed that accommodating India or being sensitive to her concerns was not really required because the gap was very great and India's capacity to retaliate was relatively limited. Therefore, what we saw from 2008, 2009, and this phenomenon increased after President Xi Jinping came to office, was a series of escalating incidents on the line of actual control, as well as some behavioral patterns, such as denying India membership of the nuclear suppliers group or opposing India's listing of terrorists in the UN Sanctions Committee, which were detrimental to the relationship. Now, Galwan, I would consider, is a turning point in India China relations. I would say that the Rajiv Gandhi Deng Xiaoping consensus has broken down, and we are moving from an era of peaceful coexistence to one of armed coexistence. By this, I do not mean to say that we are going to enter a situation of conflict or confrontation, but we are certainly going to enter a period when we cannot leave our northern boundary lightly defended or take the Chinese activities there less seriously. And therefore, what we will see is an armed coexistence along the line of actual control, as well as a relationship that is much more tense in our relationship in the region and in the rest of the world. However, how we go from here will depend not just on the actions of India, but also on China's actions. After all, we did agree that it was important to disengage from friction points in the border and subsequently to de escalate, which means that the larger part of the military forces deployed close to the border would be pulled back several hundred kilometers. While there has been some progress on disengagement from specific friction points, de escalation has not occurred. There seems to be either a hesitancy or an unwillingness on the Chinese side. And that, to my mind, does not bode well or favorably for relations going forward. So, as I said, at this point, this is a tense relationship. Our External Affairs Minister has himself characterized this as an abnormal situation. Efforts are being made from the Indian side to see how we can normalize the relationship. But we do require China to be sensitive to our concerns in the same way that they expect us to be sensitive to their concerns. And therefore, I think it will be a while before a new equilibrium will be established. Until then, we have to live with the current situation.
Now, taking it a bit broader, sir, the 20th century, as we all know, was the century of the democratic political system prevailing over the existing political system, the monarchy, communism, feudalism. Now, China has openly thrown a challenge to the democratic system, although it itself calls itself a democratic country, but we all know what it is. Now, they say that this socialism with Chinese characteristics is a superior system than democracy. So, first of all, I, as a layman, find it very difficult to understand what exactly is this socialism with Chinese characteristics. And secondly, does it have the power in itself to own the 21st century as China thinks it will?
We must recognize, Mayank ji, that when the Communist Party of China was established in the early part of the 20th century, it was established in very different circumstances to the communist movements in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union. Those were relatively industrialized or industrializing parts of the world. And therefore, the dependence for the revolution was on the urban working class. China was an agrarian society. There was no industry. There was no working class. And therefore, from the period of Mao Zedong itself, there was a sense that a new organizing principle had to be found for communism. And this was a principle based on the rural peasants. So what we see from 1921 onwards is the evolution of communist ideology from what is pure Marxism-Leninism to what is known as Marxism, Leninism, and Mao Zedong thought. This legacy of Mao to adapt and modify Marxism Leninism to the specific conditions of China continued under his successor. And therefore, Deng Xiaoping and Jiang Zemin essentially realized that while socialism was the basic ideology of the state, the conditions that existed in China were not similar to those that existed in Eastern Europe and Soviet Russia. And therefore, they coined the word socialism in one country in order to differentiate their ideological methodology from that of Marxism-Leninism. What did socialism in one country mean? Essentially, it meant that the leadership was adapting the principles of socialism to Chinese conditions and using the current late 20th century situation to also modify socialist theory in order to ensure that in practical terms, they could deliver economic and social benefits to the people. And I think we can both agree that the Chinese system was certainly able to do that. What it says about the Chinese system is that this is not an ideologically hidebound party, but one which is constantly reinventing itself as it meets new challenges. And this was the strength of the Chinese Communist Party. Now, today, in a sense, what is happening is that the current leadership sees the challenge in the 21st century as being rather different from that of the 20th century. In the 20th century, it was a matter of, firstly, survival of the Communist Party and the People's Republic of China, and secondly, the development of its economy and the stabilization of its polity. And these were reasonably achieved by the year 2000. In the current century, China is seeking to regain what it considers as its historical role of being the world's dominant civilization. Now, this is, of course, a perceived reality, because in human history, there was never a situation or an era where China was the sole dominant power. There is no doubt that in the Indo-Pacific, for instance, for almost 2000 years, China has been a significant power among the leading powers in the region. But equally in this period, there have been other great powers, notably India, Indonesia under the Majapahit and Shri Vijaya empires. There has been the Ottoman Empire in Turkey, and there have been a number of empires in Persia, or the country that is today known as Iran. Nonetheless, the Chinese leadership and Communist Party have propagated the idea that they were the dominant power and they want to regain that status. Now, the problem with that is that their political system is running against the popular trend of the 20th century, which is democracy. And therefore, the battle that they are fighting is not just a battle of power, of strength, but it is also a battle of the mind, of ideas. And the battle they are fighting is to convince the rest of the world that you don't have to be a democracy or to have freedom of thought, expression, and action in order to develop your economy. And that you can prosper in this world even if you surrender some or all of your political rights to the ruling party. Whether this will hold up against the test of time remains to be seen. But I believe this is a very important point that we as Indians need to grasp. And I say that because we are the only country which has the size of population, the diversity of population, the potential for economic growth, and the territorial spread to mount a counter challenge to the Chinese in showing and in proving that development and democracy go hand in hand. And therefore, for us, it is not simply an academic exercise, but one in which our future is also tied. And where in the long term, it will be in our hands to determine whether the trends of the 20th century, which is that democracy is the best organizing principle for international politics, will prevail, or whether the Chinese idea that you can be authoritarian in politics and you can still prosper your people will succeed.
Sir, a month ago, after the 20th Party Congress, Xi Jinping seemed invincible. And but the post this zero COVID policy, the protests after that, the protests in the Apple factory, then the protests after the Urumqi fire seem to suggest otherwise. Now, having witnessed the Tiananmen Square firsthand, what happened in Tiananmen Square in 1989, and the instances of labor, student, or organized protests, although on a small scale, do you think that this round of protests is different from the previous protest and could have the potential to maybe upstage the apple cart of Xi Jinping? And what is your assessment about this Chinese theory of the Western hand behind all this unrest going on in China?
It's important to remember that protests are a part of political life in all countries, and that China is no different from the democracies. Protests happen all the time over wage or labor problems, over bank failures, over rural or locational issues which don't have a national impact. The difference between the anti-COVID restriction protests and the earlier protests is that in multiple cities, protests took of the form of street demonstrations on a single issue that was the same whether it was in Beijing in the north or in Guangzhou in the south or in Chengdu in the southwest. And therefore, to that extent, this was the first time, at least to my mind, after the 1989 student protests, where large parts of the country and disparate populations came together to voice their concerns and opinions on a single issue. That having been said, it is important to remember that these protests were spontaneous and random. In other words, there did not appear to be any organization behind them. They were, in a sense, an outburst or expression of frustration that the Chinese people felt about the COVID restrictions after nearly 2.5 years in close confinement. And because they have been able to discover that the rest of the world is returning to a relatively normal life. Now, how this pans out subsequently depends very much on the state's reaction to these protests. The mistake that the Communist Party made in 1989 was to declare the protests to be a counter-revolution. And therefore, those who were protesting automatically became counter-revolutionaries, which, as far as the Communist Party is concerned, is the worst possible sin. And therefore, it also required use of force to crush the movement. And this resulted in a very traumatic experience for China and its people. This time around, what actions the leadership will take is still not clear. But so far, it is interesting that the leadership has quietly began to selectively undo some of these restrictions or relax some of these restrictions, including, for instance, traveling on public transport or attending meetings and so on. It is also significant that the president of China, a couple of days ago, in his meeting with the head of the European Union's Council, has talked about the Omicron variety being less dangerous and less infectious than the Delta variety. To me, both these suggest that there is likely to be a steady, gradual, below the radar easing off of the restrictions. However, what sort of political damage this will cause to the leadership still needs to be seen, because the zero COVID policy and its enforcement has been owned by the president and general secretary himself. We must remember that when Xi Jinping was faced with this crisis at the beginning of 2020, he took charge. And subsequently, through 2020 and 2021, when the rest of the world suffered and China was relatively immune from that suffering, he claimed personal credit for it. So today, if there is going to be a relaxation in the COVID policy, it is a moot point whether the Chinese people might also see it as in some way an admission of partial failure and an admission that he was not fully correct in what he was doing. And how that will impact on his political standing remains to be seen. So it is very much, as of now, a fluid situation. There don't seem to be any follow-up protests, which I presume from the Chinese leadership perspective is a positive sign. There are some relaxations, which I presume from the people's perspective is a positive sign. But let's see going forward whether these relaxations result in massive wave of COVID infections and fatalities. And if so, what that impact will be on the people and the party.
That's an interesting point, sir. Now, China, we have seen, has been growing more assertive and authoritarian, abroad and authoritarian at home. Xi Jinping has that record. So is this likely to intensify despite what has been going on and the protests kind of petering down, as he has ensured placement of his personal loyalists in the Politburo and the Central Military Commission after the 20th Party Congress?
Yeah, we must be clear about one thing, Mayankji, which is that no Chinese leader has actually wanted to democratize or to reduce the authority and power of the Chinese Communist Party. If there is one single thread that consistently runs through the history of Communist China, it is the determination of the leadership to ensure the survival and continuance in power of the Chinese Communist Party. And to that extent, Xi Jinping is no different from Deng Xiaoping, Jiang Zemin, and Hu Jintao. The difference is in the style of his functioning. Deng was faced with 25 years of Maoist chaos, which almost destroyed China. And he genuinely believed that a personality cult was deleterious to the long-term objective of preserving the power of the Communist Party. He therefore brought in limited administrative reform and collective responsibility in the leadership. In other words, they would all share in the decision-making, and there would be no supreme power that could overrule all the others and bring about a personality cult, since personality cults had proved to be extremely dangerous in China. And it is because of those systems that he brought in that China enjoyed this unprecedented period between 1990 and 2015, not only of political and social stability and enormous economic growth, but also predictability in the lives of the people. Now, essentially what President Xi Jinping has done is to reverse some of these major political and administrative decisions that Deng took. To some extent, we must recognize that he had to do this because the relaxation that had happened over the 20 or 30 years after 1980 had also led to some bad things happening. In particular, the weakening of ideology, as well as massive corruption in the party and in the state. And therefore, he was confronted with a situation where, if this situation was allowed to persist, it would eventually dilute the legitimacy of the Communist Party, because the party is not elected by the people. And therefore, its legitimacy depends upon public perception of the party being a force for good, a force for moral leadership, and a force for development. So to some extent, we need to recognize that Xi Jinping's actions were also determined by the problems that had arisen over the past 30 years. But it is also true that he has taken this further down the road towards a more authoritarian system of governance, where he has centralized power, where he has reduced the authority of the provinces, of the counties, and of the heads of the districts to take important decisions, and where he is essentially also suggesting that China needs to be more guarded in its global interactions, in its diplomatic interactions, because there may be an attempt to subvert this from the outside. And this is where I believe there is a divergence between what the late General Secretary Jiang Zemin, who passed away last week, did and what Xi Jinping is doing. Because Jiang Zemin essentially felt that if he took the political risk of opening up China and he relatively relaxed the tight controls on intellectual thought, on entrepreneurship, and on innovation, this would be helpful to China's rise. And indeed, this proved to be true. What I think Xi Jinping appears to be doing is backpedaling on the relative relaxation of controls, as well as becoming somewhat politically risk averse, not willing to take the risk to reform China and to take reform and opening up to the next level, which would further integrate China into the technological revolution that is happening in the world today. Deng Xiaoping and Jiang Zemin essentially integrated China into the industrial revolution, the manufacturing world. Today, it is not a world of manufacturing anymore. It is a world of technology. And Xi Jinping seems to be backpedaling on that integration between China and the rest of the world on technology. So I think this is going to be the challenge that Xi Jinping faces. And we have to see whether what he is doing is right or not. In other words, is the backpedaling going to ensure that China emerges as the dominant economic and technological power? Or is it going to actually stifle creativity, intellectual exchange, as well as and to cut off the benefits of globalization and thereby diminish China's capacity to surpass the United States? I think that's an open question.
He might be backpedaling on the technology front, sir, but he's definitely not backpedaling on Taiwan, which he calls national rejuvenation. The integration of Taiwan into China, mainland China, is national rejuvenation. But is it militarily, technologically, and economically in a robust position to do so within this decade, as it plans to?
Taiwan is an issue that is as dear to the heart of the Chinese people as the issue of Jammu and Kashmir is to the hearts of the Indian people. It is therefore not simply a diplomatic, a political, or a theoretical problem. It is an emotive issue. And we must understand that on emotive issues, people line up behind their leaders, even though their actions may not seem to be the wisest or the most suitable at that particular time. I think it is important for Indians to remember this whenever we look at the Taiwan issue. The second point is, if you were to ask me whether China could theoretically or hypothetically militarily invade Taiwan today, I would guardedly say this would be possible. Simply because China today has the military capability, both in terms of landing craft as well as in terms of support services if the US intervenes in order to take military control of the island. The question, however, is not simply taking control of the island. It is with dealing with the consequences of that military action. And those consequences will be economic as well as diplomatic. And these will be significant for the rest of the world. Firstly, that conflict will not be short, and it will result in a much greater economic disruption of the world than the Russia-Ukraine conflict, simply because the Indo-Pacific is the center of about 50% of the world's trade and investment. Secondly, the United States is invested in the Indo-Pacific to a far greater degree than it is in Eastern Europe, for the simple reason that many of its financial, economic, and military assets are located in the region, and because its leadership sees the Indo-Pacific as the future for maintaining the United States supremacy in the world. Therefore, it is unlikely that the United States will simply be a bystander if China were to take control of Taiwan. Thirdly, of course, Taiwan is the center of the world's semiconductor industry, and a lot of innovation comes out of Taipei and Taiwan. And therefore, if China does take Taiwan, will that leave the industry intact on that island? in such a way that China would benefit from that? That too is a question that would concern the Chinese leadership at this point. Therefore, as I said, to my mind, these will all have to be weighed carefully by China before it determines what course of action it will take. My own sense is that this is a hypothetical exercise, but we should also not forget the fact that China thinks that its centenary requires it to be once again restored to its holistic form in every sense, not only in the diplomatic, economic, and military sense of being at the center of the world, but in the territorial sense of having recovered areas that it claims it's theirs. And therefore, we should not presume that China will necessarily delay indefinitely on the Taiwan question. Equally, we should not presume that China has only the force option. China, as it becomes stronger and economically more developed, might have other options to also ensure unification in diverse forms.
Since the 19th Party Congress in 2017, when Xi Jinping raised the issue of unbalanced growth, China has seen a shift towards state-controlled enterprises. Now, recently we have seen a recession in the Chinese economy, which seems to be slowing down pretty dramatically. So, how much is this shift from this state-controlled enterprise towards towards the state-controlled enterprise from the private enterprise responsible for this slowdown in Chinese economy?
I think we should begin by recognizing that Xi Jinping has modified the economic approach of the party, but has not completely abandoned the strategy charted by Deng Xiaoping of reform. What he has done is he is talking of reform, but not of opening up. And there are two reasons for this. He thinks that the policy of reform and opening up, as it was designed by Deng Xiaoping, has run its course. Because the idea of that opening up was to bring capital and technology into China to help it to develop and catch up with the rest of the world. And Xi Jinping felt that this has been more or less achieved already. Therefore, he feels a change of approach is necessary. The second is because the reform and opening up in the past 30 years was judged by GDP growth in terms of the percentage of GDP growth. But of course, Xi Jinping feels that with the current state of affairs, because China is now a $16 to $18 trillion economy, it is not the percentage of GDP growth that matters so much as the quality of life and the quality of growth and development. And for these two reasons, there has been a shift in the approach from simply fueling growth through investment in infrastructure to ensuring quality of life and to encouraging consumption within the country in order to offset the falling exports as a result of protectionist tendencies abroad. Some of this is, of course, his own initiative, but in many cases, he is also responding to the changing global environment. The West is no longer as firm in its belief of free trade as it was, let us say, in the 1990s, because frankly speaking, emerging economies, including India's, are now able to compete with them in their own markets. Similarly, the availability of capital is substantially less. And on the contrary, the ability of China to put capital into its own industry as well as to help others is greater. So, for a variety of reasons, China no longer needs that sort of capital or technology from abroad, and it can afford to be more selective. It needs to protect areas where it is running neck to neck or even ahead of the West in terms of technology. And it needs to improve the lives of its people because the Chinese people, having got their refrigerators and cars and scooters, are now looking for clean air, clean water, healthcare, and so on and so forth. Right. So this is the reason why words like common prosperity and dual circulation have come into force. What, of course, has also happened, however, is that Xi Jinping's tenure in the highest office has also coincided with certain other global developments that are taking place. One is the pandemic, which was entirely unanticipated. The other is the excessive investment that took place in China over the last 30 years, which is not giving return on capital. And the third, of course, is the growing protectionist tendency abroad, which requires China to consume more at home. Now, this is easier said than done because ultimately the Chinese people are saving for many things, including a house, education, and old age. And ironically, because the population size is dipping, there is anxiety within the current working population that by the time they reach the age of senior citizens, there will be far less working Chinese men and women to provide for them, and therefore they cannot take social security for granted. So, on the one hand, you have the state saying spend more, and on the other hand, you have the public saying, I want to save more. And this is part of the economic problem. There are others, of course. There is over investment in the property industry, in the property market, simply because people saw that as a safe investment and one that kept on growing, but that has stopped growing now. The stock market itself is reacting to the international situation and the global recession, so that is also no longer a safe haven or a completely secure haven for investment. And you also have the absence of jobs being created for the large number of university graduates. Because increasingly, as technology replaces labor, you can have growth, but it can be jobless. So there are multiple challenges that China is facing. Some of them are not unlike what we are facing or other developing countries are facing. But the problem is made more acute by the fact that there are no safety valves in society for expressing discontent or unhappiness or frustration. And therefore, I think the challenge is, of course, economic, undoubtedly, but it also has socio-political ramifications that we need to look out for. And it will require a great deal of political skill to guide China through the next 10 to 15 years. That having been said, I think that we have also seen the kind of political skill that the Chinese leadership has demonstrated since 1980 in handling a number of difficult issues and in ensuring that China does not go off track. So we should not automatically presume that the challenge is so overwhelming that they may not be able to tackle it.
There is this economic discontent and lack of jobs also one of the reasons for these protests which have broken out recently?
I think so. I think that this would be an underlying cause. Very similar to the Tiananmen incident of 1989, there were various trends of unhappiness. Unemployment was one, high inflation was another. Intellectuals felt that the freedom of expression and speech was being curtailed, and so on. What it is not is a democratic movement. We should not assume that these protests necessarily mean that the Chinese want to establish a democracy or believe in democracy. It simply is a way of expressing frustration and the sense that the state is not being responsive to their concerns at this stage. What might happen subsequently will depend on how the state reacts.
The one final question, I was just going through Twitter this morning and I saw Defense Secretary Austin, US, saying that China is the only country with both the will and increasingly the power to reshape its region and the international order to suit its authoritarian preferences. So my question is, I mean, I was talking of China being a riddle, there are economic issues, China trying to overpower its neighbors. What exactly does China want?
Well, I think first of all, what Defense Secretary Austin said is not new. For the last 2 or 3 years, official American documents have been describing China as the principal challenger to the United States. And they have used the word pacing challenge to describe China as compared to serious threat to describe Russia. which makes it clear to those of us who read these documents that China has replaced Russia as the principal long-term challenger to the and competitor to the United States. As to what China wants, I think we should not disbelieve what their leadership says, which is that by 2049, which will be the 100th year of the establishment of the People's Republic of China, the leadership desires that China moves to the center of the world stage. And in the Chinese language, this means that China wants to replace the United States as the dominant world power. Now, this should not be taken to mean that they intend immediately to enter some sort of a conflictual situation with the United States. It only expresses their firm conviction that their economic trajectory, their military trajectory, as well as the trajectory of the United States, makes it likely that they have a fair chance of being the number one country in the world in 2049. At the very least, what they expect is that there will be a co-sharer of power with the United States, that the rest of the world will acknowledge and bow to their sensitivities, concerns, and interests, and that they will exercise some sort of a loose hegemony globally, which will help determine, if not a China-led world order, then a world order in which China is a significant and equal partner. That's really what they're looking for. Now, how they will achieve this, of course, is still a matter for the future to determine. But it is important for us as Indians to follow this carefully, simply because we too are aspiring for a greater share of the world's economic cake, and consequently of raising India's profile diplomatically and in terms of influence globally. So to the extent that we are also doing that, there is always the possibility that we will come into some sort of a friction or confrontation with the Chinese. And again, I don't mean confrontation in the military sense necessarily. But the point I'm making, the very limited point, is that it is therefore important for this generation of Indians to follow China, to study the Chinese, to learn about its economy, its society, its culture, and its foreign policy, in the same way that our generation studied the United States. Because the actions that China will take will have a fundamental impact on all our lives. Where we invest, which currency we keep our money in, where we travel, where we study, what we buy, all this to some extent will be influenced by China. And therefore, it is not a luxury anymore for Indians to say we are studying China. It has become a vital necessity.
On that note, I would like to end this conversation, sir. And thank you for sparing time for us. And we at Manthan would like to participate in this process of understanding China. And as you said, keep educating others about China also. Thank you so much, sir. Thank you, and Jai Hind.
Thank you. Thank you very much.